責めないで消さないで負けないで晴れたって持ってるはず譲れないもの
Trilogies. They're one of the most common features in the modern movie landscape, and even in an industry now inundated with ever more expansive cinematic universes, the idea of having a story told across 3 separate installments still seems to hold a great amount of appeal. The Lord of the Rings films are an excellent example of this, and they released to massive critical and commercial success.
It's a clean sweep. The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King.
So it only makes sense that a studio would want to try to replicate that success with the story that started it all, The Hobbit. Oh, and did I say a studio? Sorry, I meant 5 studios. Yeah. Other people have already covered the behind-the-scenes Mordor that was the making of the first Hobbit trilogy, but the most glaring problem of all was that this never should have been a trilogy to begin with, or even a duology. And in spite of the overall quality of the result, I am of the firm belief that there is a single very good film to be found within this trilogy. I am aware that certain changes are going to be necessary when adapting from the medium of literature to cinema, but the fact remains. The entirety of The Lord of the Rings comes out to a whopping 481,103 words, while The Hobbit clocks in at 95,356. For comparison, that puts The Hobbit in the higher end for typical novel length, while The Lord of the Rings is a sprawling epic just shy of 500,000 words. The Hobbit is slightly less than 1/5 the length of its more famous sequel, and yet its big screen adaptation was stretched to 8 hours and 52 minutes, going by the extended editions, putting it at more than 3/4 the length of The Lord of the Rings' 11 hours and 26 minutes. Now, with the changes inherent in the process of adaptation, I wouldn't expect a movie based on The Hobbit to be exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes so that the ratios line up perfectly. However, vast amounts of this trilogy are taken up with bloated scenes, filler, and tangents that are forced in just to connect the story to The Lord of the Rings and attempt to recapture the success of the earlier trilogy. But The Hobbit is a very different story, simpler, and with a much smaller scale. It should have been one movie, and it easily could have been. And here I intend to trim it into just that, going through the existing trilogy and determining what should be cut and what should be kept. As an aside, I am aware that there have been numerous fan edits of The Hobbit already. I haven't watched any myself, but from what I've read, each one brings something new to the table, and I hope mine will follow in that tradition. My mission statement, if you will, is to cut the trilogy down to one film, not to exceed a length of 4 hours, that is as accurate to the original novel as I can manage working with the materials I have. This fix will solely consist of cutting out the excess, like chiseling a rough-hewn block of marble into a work of art. The precise details of this edit, with a way to watch it, will be available at the WordPress page linked in the description of this video. Now, the Hobbit film trilogy begins with Bilbo, just before the events of The Lord of the Rings, reminiscing on his old adventures. Instead of taking 12 minutes to go over the destruction of Dale and have Bilbo interact with Frodo, we will jump right into the start of the tale, 60 years prior, and this scene is great. It perfectly establishes Gandalf as the peculiar, temperamental wizard and Bilbo as the easygoing, domestic Shire dweller, and both Ian McKellen and Martin Freeman portray the two characters perfectly.
No idea you were still in business.
And where else should I be?
Well,
in fact, a lot of the earlier parts of this movie don't need to be taken out. I cut the extended Bilbo goes to the market scene, but almost everything about the dwarves arriving is really well done, giving us a glimpse of their various character traits with a lot of good comedy.
I'm sorry.
Apology accepted.
What? Oh, no. It hasn't been cancelled. No one told us.
No, nothing's been cancelled.
That's a relief.
Have you heard of the High Elves?
It does need a little trimming, but overall it really does the novel justice, as does the tavern song-style interpretation of Blunt the Knives.
Blunt the knives, bend the forks,
Smash the bottles and burn the corks.
The trilogy does a good job of properly establishing the quest, and I really like that they give Bilbo a larger degree of agency in choosing to come along, and show Gandalf having a little more concern over the danger he is putting Bilbo in. And the back and forth between Thorin and his companions establishes him as a rough-around-the-edges leader deeply troubled by the loss of his home and people, which helps explain his selfish actions later in my version. I largely cut the Arkenstone from the plot, both for the sake of accuracy to the novel and to avoid a repeat of the magical artifact that corrupts your mind element that The Lord of the Rings already did far more powerfully. By the way, this rendition of Misty Mountains Cold is pure gold. We don't really need to see Thorin's backstory in the Battle of Moria, or have a scene with the orcs who are pursuing them. In fact, as Bilbo is the focus of this story, I've cut Azog out almost entirely, leaving him as a background character that doesn't even get mentioned by name. And besides, I like Thorin having an air of mystery about him, with Bilbo and the audience learning more gradually as the story progresses. For now, the only sign of the orcs will be the distant howls and shrieks that the group hears while they're camped in the night. For the trolls scene, instead of having a weird battle between them and the dwarves, I just had the trolls go straight for the use Bilbo as a hostage option.
Lay down your arms, or we'll whip his off.
Yep, that's me.
Given how the movie is, we're going to have the dwarves lose this way anyway, and though I don't really buy that Thorin would be willing to throw all the others' lives away just for Bilbo's sake this early on, my hands are kind of tied here. At least we get some good comedy out of it.
Not that one, he's infected. Yeah, he's got worms in his tubes.
I'm also cutting all the filler with Radagast, Saruman, Galadriel, the Necromancer, Dol Guldur, and any other appendices material. As much as I like dog sledding, Radagast and his ridiculous rabbits are not making the final cut. However, I will leave a little bit of the orc chase just to give us a good tense scene, and force Thorin to go to Rivendell against his wishes. The company then arrives in the Valley of the Elves, where filler abounds.
Can't say a fancy elf maze myself. Too thin. Although, that one there's not bad.
That's not an elf, mate.
Though there is some great stuff here, mainly involving Bilbo. Because the White Council stuff is getting cut, we move to the company departing from Rivendell, and we get some cool landscape shots set to Howard Shore's immaculate score, which is one of the few things that remains consistently great across the entire trilogy. Then we come to the Stone Giants scene. Now, in the novels, it's said that Thorin's company encounters stone giants in the Misty Mountains, but these creatures are typically interpreted to simply be a subset of trolls. In this movie, however, we get several hundred feet tall titans made of literal stone, which poses a huge problem to the world building of Middle-earth. A single one of these things could easily kill Smaug, and wipe out an entire nation besides. And yet we're supposed to believe that they just wander around the mountains and don't impact the broader world at all? The real reason this scene was included was so they could sell 3D tickets, which doesn't fly with me. Instead, I just cut straight from the group making their way along the mountain trail to them entering the cave. I also heavily simplified the whole down to Goblin Town sequence, including removing the song that was already cut from the theatrical release. Though it is present in the novel, I'm afraid it comes across as far too goofy in the film. This brings us to the famous Riddles in the Dark scene, widely regarded as the best part of the trilogy, and for good reason. It manages to perfectly balance the eerie, frightening atmosphere of Gollum and his cave with the lighthearted nature of Bilbo and their riddle competition.
If Baggins loses, we eat it whole.
Fair enough.
It's golden, and it's all staying in. However, I cannot say the same for the dwarves' escape from Goblin Town. This whole fight/chase goes on for way too long, when all that's really needed is Gandalf's spell and a quick cutaway.
On your mark, get ready, start.
And since one of the primary aims of this recut is to make Bilbo the focal character, we don't really need to see Gandalf and the dwarves again until Bilbo meets back up with them. To finish off the first of the 3 films, we have the 5 fir trees scene. This part also gets dragged on too long, and leads to an awkward payoff as Thorin comes to recognize Bilbo's value to the party 1/3 of the way through the trilogy, only to renege on this in the next film. Because one of my goals was to remove Azog, I cut the entirety of the scene where Thorin charges Azog's forces and Bilbo jumps in to save him. This will help my rewrite better conform to the structure of the novel, where it is not until the encounter with the spiders in Mirkwood that Bilbo really demonstrates bravery and prowess in combat.
Let's give him an air show.
They fly now?
And I know it seems weird that the eagles just drop them here instead of flying the group further, but it is explained in the books. The eagles hate flying over the territory of men, who tend to shoot arrows at them to protect their livestock. Not the best explanation, sure, but it's something. And I can't really do anything about it not being present here.
I have not forgotten the arrow that brought me down so many years ago.
I cut out the credits, naturally, though it is a shame about the Misty Mountain song having to be cut. I really like it.
Far over the
With that, we move on to the next movie, The Desolation of Smaug. It starts with an extended flashback to Thorin visiting Gandalf and Bree, and it's totally unnecessary. Also, we can't have those pesky titles getting in the way of our immersion. Most of the stuff with Beorn is pretty cool, so it stays. Not the 5-minute segment with the dwarves reintroducing each other 2 by 2, though. But it is nice to catch a glimpse of some of the more fantastical elements of Middle-earth that still aren't too, well, this. After enjoying Beorn's hospitality and departing from his house, the group then comes to Mirkwood. Here, I'll cut out the scenes that tie into the extraneous plots, as well as some of the excess from the main plot. The sequence works well, conveying the eerie, enchanted nature of the forest, but it just drags on a little too long.
We send the lightest first.
The spider scene doesn't really require any trimming until the dwarves get free, and I like how we get a glimpse of how the ring is already beginning to work its dark influence on Bilbo's mind. However, I really don't like how they forced yet another storyline in with the addition of Toriel, and her love story with Keely the dwarf. I'm hardly the first person to criticize this part, but while I can at least understand why the writers added in appendices-related material like the White Council and the Necromancer, the last thing this bloated trilogy needed was a Romeo and Juliet-style star-crossed lovers storyline.
Aren't you going to search me?
I could have anything down my trousers.
Or nothing.
After all, it is called The Hobbit, and yet by the time we get to the third movie of the trilogy, Bilbo essentially gets written out of his own story.
Why are we still here?
But I know, I'm getting ahead of myself. Thorin and the other dwarves are brought to the palace of the Elf King and imprisoned. Lee Pace is great as Thranduil, regal and arrogant, and the interaction between him and Thorin gives us some good insight into the pride of both their characters.
All your bitcoins on this flash drive or you're dead.
Oh, come on, dude. That's all my bitcoin for lunch, man.
But then we get more stuff about Dol Guldur, and the introduction of a love triangle between Keely, Legolas, and Tauriel. Great. And by great, I mean nope. Bilbo sets the dwarves free in a good scene. But then we get an extremely drawn-out, CGI-heavy, video game-level choreographed chase fight sequence in the river. I've watched some of the behind-the-scenes for this trilogy, and it's a shame seeing how much effort went into producing parts like this, because it is entirely unnecessary. And after this, we cut to Gandalf exploring Dol Guldur. Geez, even I didn't remember how much filler was in these movies until I rewatched them in full. In my cut, we go straight from Bilbo falling in the water to the dwarves washing up on shore downstream. Also, during the now cut chase, Keely is injured with a Morgul blade, which leads to even more bloat later on when the group arrives in Lake Town. I cut out as much of this little subplot as possible. Here, Bard the Lake Man stumbles upon the group. The actor is good, but this ridiculous archery skill he displays is, well, a little ridiculous. Also, I trimmed the scene where they haggle with Bard, keeping the essentials, and then cut all the following stuff with the elves and orcs. We get a nice little scene of the group sailing into Lake Town, followed by a bunch of unnecessary stuff. And by bunch, I mean a ton. Bard's smuggling, the Master, Alfred, their agents spying on Bard, prophecy, what? Bard's family, Keely's injury, and then later orcs attack, and elves fight them off, and Tauriel shows up, and yep, they really are going for a star-crossed lovers thing. In the middle of The Hobbit. I just cut straight from Bard's barge docking to the dwarves entering his house, with a little intro to Bard's family and Balin giving the backstory of his ancestor, Girion, Lord of Dale. This sets up Bard slaying the dragon without wasting too much time. Next, I simplified the stealing weapons and getting arrested sequence, which brings our heroes before the Master of Lake Town. I also trimmed the ceremony for their departure heavily. Thorin's company then hikes up to Erebor, hoping to find the hidden door before time runs out. We then get more junk with Gandalf and Radagast creeping around Dol Guldur, which I got rid of, interspersed with the dwarves and Bilbo searching for a way in. Radagast, have you seen the plot anywhere? I'm sure it must be here somewhere. But seriously, they have Gandalf find Thorin's father Thrain, who has gone mad in the dungeons, and then we get another flashback to the Battle of Moria that doesn't even really fit in with the one we saw earlier. Not on my watch. After dragging out the search for the entrance a little, Bilbo cracks the puzzle, and the group enters Erebor. We then cut to Lake Town, where Bard and the dwarves who got left behind tend to Keely's wound. Oh, sorry, did I say we cut to that? I meant we just cut it. Just like the stuff in Dol Guldur that keeps getting shoved in here. And now we come to the other greatest scene in this trilogy, Bilbo's confrontation with Smaug. It's funny just how faithful this part is to the novel given everything else surrounding it, but hey, I'll take what I can get. I mean, at least it's not this. Also, orcs start attacking Lake Town and get driven off by elves? What? Did these people even read this book? We get a massive amount of filler here, and I'm talking like Wolf's Rain episodes 15 to 18 levels of filler. There's this drawn-out sequence where the dwarves go into the mountain and try to fight Smaug because, Thorin really wants the Arkenstone, I guess? And don't get me wrong, he cares about it in the book, but he's not suicidally reckless. The dwarves operate all these complicated gadgets and pieces of machinery that apparently work after centuries of non-use, and there's way, way too much CGI, and the whole thing turns into this giant slapstick routine that just makes Smaug look incompetent and harmless. You really want me to believe that not a single dwarf dies throughout this entire ordeal? Okay. It should go without saying that all of this is getting cut. In my version, we go straight from Smaug breathing fire at Bilbo to Smaug flying out towards Lake Town. And of course, the credits get skipped. Sorry, Ed Sheeran. And so finally, we come to the third installment in the wasn't supposed to be a trilogy, the Battle of the Five Armies. Yeah, I know Lindsay Ellis already made that joke, but it's a good joke, and it's even funnier because it's true. And here I thought just having 5 writers working on a movie was bad. Naturally, we skip the opening titles and get straight into Smaug's attack on Lake Town. I got rid of all the stuff with the Master and Alfred, Keely and Tariel, and just focused on the general devastation and Bard's heroic stand. Also, since I eliminated the Bard gets arrested by the Master subplot in the previous film, I cut out anything related to that here as well. Smaug's death is good. Not really much else to say here. But a lot of the aftermath of his death isn't essential. I just have Bard reunite with his family and get celebrated as a hero, and cut the rest.
Is this guy supposed to be Alfred?
I kept a little of the dwarves in Erebor, and show a glimpse of the orc army marching towards the mountain. But other than that, we don't really need many of these scenes. Especially not the Bill Guldur stuff. If you thought it was bad before, just wait. We get to watch the stunt doubles for Ian McKellen, Cate Blanchett, and Christopher Lee fight CGI death metal album art.
I will destroy you.
And of course, it wouldn't be a modern-day prequel without a few lines or scenes stolen shamelessly from the original. Do they not realize the irony of that being a villain's line? Probably not. Also, as I mentioned near the beginning of this video, I've cut out most of the Thorin getting corrupted by the Arkenstone subplot. It's just an inferior rehash of the One Ring, and it takes away a lot of Thorin's agency in comparison to the novel. Unlike the Ring, the Arkenstone does not contain great power in and of itself, and so Thorin being driven mad by it makes for a far less compelling story than Thorin being a fallible character who lets his own greed and pride drive him to make mistakes. The scene where the elves bring supplies is good, as is Bard's parley with Thorin, but the stuff with Thorin going mad over the Arkenstone gets cut, as does Legolas and Tariel's scouting mission up in Gundabad. Bilbo's sneaking out and reuniting with Gandalf is largely faithful to the novel, as is the scene where Thranduil and Bard reveal that they have the Arkenstone, though I did trim a lot of Gandalf and Thranduil's discussion about Sauron.
You would steal from me.
Steal from you? No.
You have no claim over me, you miserable...
Right, because you...
Whoa, just take it easy, man.
Dane and the dwarves of the Iron Hills then arrive, and I am definitely going to cut out the part where the elves and dwarves start killing each other, as well as the Earth Eaters tunneling up through the ground. Instead, it'll just look like the orcs came through some naturally existing tunnels. As an aside, this thing with the Earth Eaters is probably the most egregious lore violation present in this trilogy. The people making this knew full well that the sandworms Tolkien mentions in the eastern deserts were a type of dragon, not these graboid Alaskan bullworm knockoffs. And so out they go. And here, we come to the actual Battle of the Five Armies, or as Screen Junkies called it in their Honest trailer, the bloating of the 5 pages. Did I mention that in the novel, the entirety of this battle takes up only 5 pages? Because it does. This story was never supposed to be about grand battles. It was supposed to be about, well, the Hobbit. His personal journey, his individual struggles and triumphs. But here we have a nearly 3-hour movie dedicated to like less than a fifth of the book. And so we just have to sit here and watch several giant CGI armies smash into each other for almost 2 whole hours. It should go without saying that I've cut out the vast majority of this. In the novel, Bilbo gets hit on the head and then comes to after the battle, speaks with Thorin briefly before the latter passes, and then heads home. And that's all we need here to complete our story. I cut it so that just as the elves and dwarves are about to fight, the characters hear something in the distance and all look up dramatically. Then we see unnamed orc leader calling forth his armies from the naturally formed tunnels. I kept less than 2 minutes of combat, then had Bilbo put on the ring, flee, and get hit on the head. There's no need for over 100 minutes of this, or this, or this, or this. Now, Thorin's death scene is really, really good. Seriously, I'm not above praising these movies when they get stuff right. It stays in, of course. But then we get stuff like this. Then they try to force this in as if they're being all cheeky.
There's a young ranger amongst them. You should meet him. is known in the wild as Strider.
Really? Really? If we're going by the original timeline of the books, Aragorn is 10 years old right now. Maybe 11 if we want to be really pedantic about how long this quest took. I know the Dunedain are special, but I'm pretty sure they're not that special.
Hey. Yeah? You ever wonder why we're here? It's one of life's great mysteries, isn't it?
In my cut, we jump straight from Bilbo getting knocked on the head to him waking up after the battle has been won, seeing the eagles flying overhead. After reconciling with a mortally wounded Thorin in a genuinely touching scene, we get a brief, wordless interaction between Bilbo and Gandalf, Thorin's funeral, and Bilbo's heartfelt departure. He then arrives back home to find himself declared dead and his possessions in the process of being auctioned off. Faithful to the book, and a nice humorous note to end on. Then, finally back in the peace and quiet of Bag End, Bilbo looks at the ring, and we cut to 60 years later, where an older Bilbo is doing the same in the middle of working on his memoirs. Gandalf then knocks at the door, setting in motion the events of The Lord of the Rings, and the camera comes to rest on a map of the Lonely Mountain before the credits roll. And that's it. If you'd like to view the Cardinal cut, you can check out the WordPress page linked in the description of this video. But please only download the cut if you have already purchased a legal copy of the trilogy. This way, you support the original creators and help protect the fan editing community.
Gotta start up the airplane. I've got to get away from here. Please, Mr. Pilot, you gotta put me back in the sky. I've got to get away from here.
Medic! Medic!